Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo was not a man Rome loved. He was useful, which in the late Republic was a different thing entirely. He commanded legions in the social war with the kind of cold efficiency that wins campaigns and loses friends, and when the dust settled on that conflict in 89 BC, the Senate awarded him a triumph he had technically earned and politically resented granting. His soldiers, by more than one account, tried to assassinate him. They failed. He died 2 years later of disease during Sulla's march on Rome, and the city did not mourn him with any particular sincerity. What he left behind was land, money, an extensive network of client relationships across the region of Picenum in northeastern Italy, and a 17-year-old son who had watched all of it very carefully. And Pompey grew up inside a lesson his father never articulated, but demonstrated continuously, that in Rome, the distance between power and legitimacy was managed, not closed. You could hold real authority without the offices that were supposed to authorize it. You could be loathed by the aristocracy and still command their cooperation, provided you controlled something they needed. His father had controlled soldiers. Pompey understood from an early age that he had inherited that same asset, and unlike his father, he intended to make people grateful for it. What he could not inherit was the family's reputation, because the family's reputation was a complicated liability. Pompeius Strabo was associated in the Roman political memory with opportunism, which with playing multiple factions against each other during the civil turbulence of the early 80s, with a certain ruthlessness that the Senate found useful in wartime and distasteful afterward. His son would spend the better part of a decade carefully separating himself from that image, not by denouncing his father, but by being conspicuously indispensable to men more prestigious than his father had ever managed to become. The opportunity arrived sooner than anyone would have reasonably predicted. In 83 BC, Sulla landed in Italy to reclaim what Marius and his successors had taken from him, and Pompey, then 23 years old, raised 3 legions from his father's client estates in Picenum without waiting for anyone's authorization to do so. There was no office that permitted this. There was no legal mechanism that explained it. There were simply 3 legions, under a young man's command, marching to join the most powerful Roman general alive. Sulla, who was not easily impressed and not particularly gentle with people who tried to impress him, reportedly greeted Pompey as a general rather than as a subordinate. Whether that moment unfolded exactly as the sources suggest is difficult to verify. What is not difficult to verify is the result. Pompey fought in Sulla's name across 3 campaigns, performed with consistent success, and was granted a triumph in 81 BC, at an age when Roman law and custom would have had him still working his way through junior magistracies. Rome's constitution was not accidental. The Cursus Honorum, the sequential ladder of public offices a man was expected to climb before being trusted with armies and provinces, existed precisely to prevent the concentration of military power in men too young, too ambitious, or too independent to be institutionally accountable. Pompey was all 3, and the system bent for him anyway, because Sulla needed the victories more than he needed the precedent to hold. That calculation would repeat itself throughout Pompey's career, made by different men for different reasons, and each time it happened, it made the next exception slightly easier to justify. He was called Magnus, the Great, somewhere in this period, a title the sources attached to his African campaign of 81 BC, where he defeated the Marian general Domitius Ahenobarbus and received his triumph with an extravagance that irritated Sulla and delighted the crowds. He may have applied the name to himself before anyone granted it officially. He may have simply refused to discourage it. The distinction matters less than the instinct it reveals. Pompey understood that identity in Roman public life was partly constructed, and he began constructing his early, before the Senate had decided what to make of him. They were still deciding. He was already moving. The triumph of 81 BC should have been a ceiling. That was how Rome's political architecture worked. Extraordinary measures justified by extraordinary circumstances, granted once, then absorbed back into the normal order of things. The Senate expected Pompey to take his laurels, find a respectable magistracy, and begin the slower work of becoming a proper Roman statesman. He was 24 years old, he had his title, and the reasonable next step was patience. He was not interested in patience. Within a decade, he had been granted 2 additional independent commands, fought in 2 separate theatres, and received a second triumph before holding a single elected office. The mechanism that produced these outcomes was not corruption exactly, and it was not simple ambition operating in isolation. It was something more structural. Rome kept generating crises that required commanders it trusted, and Pompey kept being the most available man with a proven record. The Republic's institutions were not designed for sustained civil turbulence, and in the 80s and 70s BC, sustained civil turbulence was the operating condition. Into that gap, Pompey moved with a consistency that looked, depending on your position, either like patriotic service or like a man who had learned to need emergencies the way other men need offices. Sicily fell to him first, as in 82 BC, where he was sent to clear the island of Marian resistance. He did so efficiently and without particular mercy toward the commander he captured, Gnaeus Carbo, whom he had executed despite a relationship that some sources describe as prior acquaintance. Cicero, who later knew Pompey well and wrote about him with the particular frustration of genuine affection, called what happened to Carbo an act that stained the young general's record before it had properly begun. Pompey appears to have weighed that criticism against the result and found the arithmetic acceptable. Africa followed, where the campaign was harder, the terrain less forgiving, and the outcome just as decisive. He returned to Rome demanding a triumph Sulla had not planned to grant, on the grounds that triumphs required a minimum rank Pompey had not achieved, and the negotiation that followed ended with Sulla conceding. The sources record that Sulla laughed during the exchange, which may be accurate, or may be the kind of detail a later tradition adds to soften what was, functionally, a 24-year-old forcing a dictator's hand. The second triumph, in 71 BC, was more consequential and more complicated. Pompey had spent the intervening years watching Spain become a problem Rome could not solve. Quintus Sertorius, a Marian commander of genuine strategic ability, had built something in the Iberian Peninsula that functioned less like a rebel holdout and more like a parallel Roman state, with its own senate, its own client relationships, its own durable legitimacy among the local population. Several Roman commanders had gone to Spain and come back diminished. Pompey went in 77 BC as proconsul, a title arranged for him without the consulship the title was supposed to follow, and fought Sertorius for 5 years across a campaign that was never clean and never fully decisive until Sertorius was assassinated by his own officers in 72 BC. Pompey defeated the remnants, wrote a letter to the Senate informing them he had pacified the province, and crossed back into Italy just in time to intercept the final fugitives from Spartacus's slave rebellion, which Marcus Crassus had spent the better part of 2 years suppressing at considerable cost. What Pompey did with that timing was not subtle. He reported to the Senate that he had ended the slave war. Crassus, who had bled for that campaign, understood exactly what had happened and did not forget it. The two men celebrated triumphs in succession. Crassus a lesser ovation, Pompey the full ceremony, and were then, by a political logic neither fully controlled, pushed into a joint consulship in 70 BC, despite Pompey having held none of the prerequisite offices and being technically below the legal age. They governed together with open mutual contempt and reasonable administrative competence, which was perhaps the most Roman outcome available. The Senate had now bent its own rules for Pompey 3 times in less than 15 years. Each concession had been framed as exceptional. None of them felt exceptional anymore. The grain was the thing, not the pirates themselves, not the raids on coastal towns, or the humiliation of Roman vessels taken in open water, but the grain. Rome by the late 60s BC was a city of perhaps 1 million people who did not feed themselves, who could not feed themselves, who depended on a continuous flow of supply from Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, moving through a Mediterranean that had become, over the course of a generation, genuinely dangerous to cross. The pirates were not a new problem. They had been accumulating power in the eastern Mediterranean for decades, operating out of Cilicia with a sophistication that went well beyond opportunistic raiding. They had fleets, they had harbors, they had arrangements with certain eastern kings that amounted to informal diplomacy. Rome had sent commanders against them before. The commanders had returned with limited results and reasonable explanations. By 67 BC, the situation had deteriorated past the point where reasonable explanations satisfied anyone. The price of grain in Rome had risen to levels that made the city's dependence on imported supply a daily political fact rather than an abstract vulnerability. Into that atmosphere, The tribune Aulus Gabinius introduced a law that proposed to solve the problem by giving a single commander authority over the entire Mediterranean Sea and every coastline extending 50 miles inland, with the power to raise troops, requisition supplies, and operate without senatorial interference for up to 3 years. The law did not name Pompey. It described a command that fit him precisely. The Senate's reaction was immediate and nearly unanimous in opposition. Catullus, one of the most respected voices in the chamber, argued on the floor that concentrating this much power in a single man was the mechanism by which republics ended. He was not wrong as a matter of historical analysis. He was also speaking to a city where bread prices had become a political emergency, and the popular assemblies passed the Lex Gabinia without significant difficulty. Pompey accepted the command with a public performance of reluctance that no one found entirely convincing, and began organizing. What followed genuinely surprised people who had expected a competent campaign. Pompey divided the Mediterranean into 13 separate zones, assigned subordinate commanders to each, and ran a coordinated sweep that drove the pirates from the Western Sea before they could consolidate in the east. The entire operation took 40 days to clear the Western Mediterranean. The Cilician strongholds fell within 3 months. The total campaign ran to 49 days by the most conservative ancient count. Rome had been bracing for a multi-year war and received instead a fait accompli. The speed was not accidental. It was the product of a logistical and organizational intelligence that Pompey had been developing since Picenum, and it was the clearest demonstration in his career of what he could accomplish when given resources proportional to the problem. The Senate ratified the outcome, and then almost immediately extended his authority eastward, where Mithridates of Pontus had resumed hostilities against Rome in what had become, across several decades, a conflict no single commander had been able to conclude. Pompey replaced Lucullus, who had fought brilliantly and administered badly, and whose army had essentially stopped cooperating with him, and within 2 years had driven Mithridates out of his kingdom and into a flight that ended with the king's death in 63 BC. What Pompey then did with the eastern settlement occupied him for several more years and represented something beyond military command. He founded cities, redrew provincial boundaries, installed and removed client kings, and constructed a framework of Roman influence across Syria, Judea, and the Anatolian interior that would shape the region's political geography for generations. He was not governing these territories in any formal constitutional sense. He was doing something the Republic's institutional vocabulary had no clean word for. He returned to Italy in 62 BC and, in a gesture his contemporaries noted with varying degrees of relief and suspicion, disbanded his army before crossing into Roman territory. It was the correct thing to do constitutionally. It was also a demonstration, made in full public view, that Pompey considered his own legitimacy more valuable than the leverage his soldiers represented. The Senate, watching him disarm, did not immediately move to give him what he had come home expecting. He had come back from the east expecting ratification. Not gratitude exactly. Pompey was too experienced a political operator to expect gratitude from the Senate, but a functional acknowledgement that the eastern settlement he had constructed was sound policy, and that the land grants his veterans had been promised were a debt Rome intended to honor. Neither came easily. The Senate stalled on the land bill. It refused to ratify his eastern arrangements as a single package, insisting instead on reviewing each provision individually, which was less a serious objection than a method of indefinite delay managed by men who understood that delay was the most effective weapon available to them. Lucullus, whose command Pompey had replaced in the east, and who nursed that displacement with considerable patience, was among those pushing hardest against ratification. Cato, whose opposition to concentrated power was principled rather than personal, provided the philosophical backbone. Together they made the Senate a wall Pompey could not move through by the methods he had always used, which were military success and the implicit suggestion that his goodwill was worth preserving. He tried the legal path for 2 years and accomplished nothing durable. In 60 BC, he made a different calculation. Julius Caesar had returned from his propraetorship in Spain with debts, ambition, and a political intelligence that had been sharpening itself against Roman institutional resistance for the better part of a decade. Marcus Crassus had money in quantities that made him structurally important to almost any political project, and a grievance against Pompey that had not diminished since the triumviral theatre of their joint consulship. The arrangement the 3 men reached was not a formal institution and left no founding document. It was an alignment of interests: Pompey's need for legislative results, Caesar's need for a consular platform and a subsequent command, Crassus's need for relief on the tax farming contracts his equestrian clients were bleeding under. Each man brought something the others required. None of them trusted the arrangement to outlast its usefulness, which was perhaps the most honest assessment any of them made. Caesar's consulship in 59 BC pushed through the land bill by force of popular assembly when the Senate blocked it through traditional obstruction, and Pompey's veterans received their grants. The Eastern settlement was ratified. Caesar left for Gaul the following year with a command that was supposed to produce enough military credit to make him politically viable when he returned. What it produced instead was something on a different scale entirely, and the reports that filtered back to Rome over the following years, of tribes subjugated, of the Rhine crossed, of Britain reached, described a campaign that was expanding beyond the scope of what anyone in 59 BC had authorized or anticipated. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter Julia in that same year, as part of the relational architecture meant to hold the alliance together. The sources that describe the marriage suggest it was more than transactional. Pompey was in his mid-40s, Julia considerably younger, and by multiple accounts the affection between them was genuine in a way that complicated the political calculus rather than simplifying it. When she died in childbirth in 54 BC, the loss was personal before it was strategic. Pompey did not immediately remarry into Caesar's family. He remarried into Scipio's, which pointed in a different direction entirely. Crassus was dead by 53 BC, killed at Carrhae in a Parthian campaign that ended in one of the most complete military disasters in Roman history. The third weight that had kept the arrangement in equilibrium was gone, and what remained between Pompey and Caesar was no longer mediated by a shared interest in Crassus's containment. The Senate, reading the situation with the clarity that comes from watching two men grow too large for the same room, began to cultivate Pompey as a counterweight to Caesar. Pompey accepted that positioning without fully committing to its implications. He spoke of legal solutions. He expressed, in conversations Cicero recorded with some frustration, a preference for Caesar's political defeat over his destruction. Whether that preference reflected genuine restraint or a failure to understand what Caesar had become by then is a question the subsequent months would answer with considerable violence. The Senate pressed for a final resolution. Pompey, who had spent his career mastering situations he had prepared for, he was moving toward one he hadn't. Caesar crossed the Rubicon on the 10th of January, 49 BC, and the world Pompey had spent 30 years constructing began to come apart at a speed that left almost no room for the kind of deliberate repositioning he had always relied on. The Senate had issued its ultimatum, Caesar had refused it, and the single legion marching south through the Italian winter was not the opening move of a cautious man testing his options. It was a declaration that the constitutional framework both men had been maneuvering within for a decade was no longer the operative reality. Pompey left Rome. The decision has attracted more retrospective judgment than almost any other in the late Republic, and most of that judgment misses what the situation actually looked like from inside it. Pompey's veteran legions were in Spain, and the troops available in Italy were recently levied, undertrained, and of uncertain loyalty in a confrontation between two men, each of whom had spent years building personal relationships with soldiers. Staying in Rome meant fighting a defensive action in a city that could not be held, with forces that could not yet be trusted, against a commander whose speed of movement had already demonstrated itself in Gaul. The strategic logic of withdrawal to the east, where Pompey's name still carried the weight of the settlements he had built a decade earlier, where client kings owed him debts that predated their relationships with Caesar, was coherent. His officers understood it. His allies, in the moments before panic displaced analysis, understood it. What none of them fully accounted for was how withdrawal would look. And Rome watched Pompey leave and drew its own conclusions. The man who had cleared the Mediterranean in 49 days, who had ended the Mithridatic war that had outlasted every commander before him, was retreating from a single legion. The image settled into the political consciousness of the city before Pompey had crossed the Adriatic, and it never fully lifted. He spent 49 BC assembling in Greece what was, by any objective measure, a formidable force. 9 legions, a substantial cavalry advantage, supply lines that ran through territories he had organized himself. Caesar crossed into Greece in 48 BC with fewer men, stretched logistics, and the particular quality of momentum that had been accumulating around him since the Rubicon. The two armies met at Pharsalus in Thessaly in August of that year, and what happened in that afternoon remains one of the more analysed engagements in ancient military history, not because the outcome was inevitable, but because it so nearly wasn't. Pompey's plan was defensible on paper. He held the cavalry superiority, positioned on his left flank, intended to sweep around Caesar's right and collapse the formation from behind while the infantry lines engaged. Caesar had anticipated it, pulled cohorts from his third line and redeployed them at an angle specifically to meet the cavalry charge. When Pompey's horsemen broke under that response and the repositioned cohorts turned into the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry, the battle moved faster than the command structure could absorb. Pompey, watching from the cavalry position, saw the line fracture and made a decision. He rode back to camp. He was inside his tent when the camp itself fell. He reached the coast with a small group of companions and took a ship east, moving through the Aegean with the particular desperation of a man who still had assets and no longer had a clear picture of where to deploy them. His officers proposed Parthia, where the king had reason to oppose Caesar and resources to support a continued campaign. They proposed Africa, where Pompey's ally Cato was organizing republican resistance with methodical determination. Pompey chose Egypt, where the young Ptolemy XIII held a throne that Pompey's own political decisions had helped to stabilize years earlier. The reasoning was not irrational. A debt that old, from a client that dependent, should have been worth something. The boat that came out from the Egyptian shore on the 28th of September, the 48 BC, carried men Ptolemy's advisors had selected. The calculation they had made was straightforward. Caesar was the future, Pompey was the past, and a head was easier to present as a gift than an army. Pompey stepped off his ship and into a decision that had already been made without him. He was dead before he reached the shore. Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later and was presented with what the Egyptians had prepared. The sources record that he wept. He then had the man who ordered the killing executed. History has never fully agreed on what either gesture meant, and perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Some things resist the clean verdict. He was given no funeral in Rome. His head was buried somewhere on the Egyptian coast by a freedman who had served him, and a man whose name the sources preserve, Philippus, perhaps because the indignity of the scene demanded that someone be recorded as having cared. The greatest Roman general of his generation, the man who had reorganized the Eastern Mediterranean and held more simultaneous commands than the Constitution had language for, was interred in foreign sand by a single attendant, while the war that had destroyed him continued without pause. What he had built did not disappear with him. The Eastern settlements survived, absorbed into the administrative architecture of the empire that Caesar's heir would eventually construct. The client relationships, the provincial boundaries, the city foundations scattered across Anatolia and the Levant, these outlasted the Republic itself. Which is a particular kind of irony, given that preserving the Republic was the cause Pompey had nominally died for. His enemies finished the war against Caesar. They lost. His sons fought on. They died in the field, the last of them at Munda in 45 BC, and with them ended whatever remained of Pompey's direct political legacy. The title Magnus had followed him from his 20s to his death. Whether it ever fit depends on what you think greatness in that context required. He was the most successful Roman commander of his era by almost any measurable standard, and he lost the only contest history ultimately decided to remember. That asymmetry is not incidental. It reflects something true about how the late Republic worked and how it ended, which is that the man who respected the rules of the game, or who disbanded his army at the Italian border and waited for institutions to honor what he had earned, was defeated by a man who had concluded the rules were a choice rather than a constraint. Rome did not punish that conclusion. It rewarded it.